the day he told her coldly. 6 years later, she boarded his yacht with a blonde son who had his eyes. The office was filled with the muted glow of the morning sun, which filtered through the tall glass windows, glinting off polished steel fixtures, and the impeccable sheen of a mahogany desk. Edward Hayes stood near the window, his posture rigid, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate, an armor that reflected his wealth and control. Behind him, the Seattle skyline stretched endlessly, a reminder of all he had built and everything he believed he could never risk losing. Sarah stood near his desk, holding the small white stick in her trembling hands, her heart pounding as if it would burst through her ribs. Her blue eyes searched his face for something: compassion, recognition, perhaps even love. But what she found was a mask of cold calculation that stole her breath. She had rehearsed this moment for days, imagining different reactions, hoping for some version of the man she once thought she knew. In her mind, he would walk to her, take her in his arms, and embrace the truth with the same passion he once showed in private moments. Instead, as her voice cracked and the words came out, words that should have changed everything, he didn't move, didn't even flinch. His gaze briefly flickered to the test she held out, and then his lips curved into a faint, mocking smile. "You are a mistake," he said, his tone flat, each word deliberate, designed to cut deeply and leave no room for hope. The phrase hit her like a blade, stealing the air from her lungs. For a long moment, she could only stare at him, her body frozen, her throat tight, as if it refused to release the scream struggling to get out. "Edward," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is your son. Our son." She held out the test to him, as if the undeniable proof in her hand could reach him where words could not. He finally turned to face her, his penetrating blue eyes like fragments of ice, devoid of warmth. "No, Sarah," he said with chilling certainty. "He is not mine. He never will be. I don't want this, and I won't let it drag me down. Do you understand?" His voice rose slightly at the end, not with passion, but with irritation, as if she were an employee who had made an unforgivable error, instead of the woman who had once shared his bed and his whispered promises. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's chest heaved as tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She wanted to scream, to force him to see the cruelty of his words, but no sound came from her lips. Her hands trembled so violently that she nearly dropped the test, and when she finally lowered her arm, it felt as if she were lowering a piece of her shattered soul. Edward turned back to the window, his attention already shifting, as if the matter had been resolved with absolute certainty. His reflection in the glass looked untouchable, proud, and soulless. A man who had chosen power over humanity. Sarah forced her feet to move, though each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Her body shook with the effort of holding herself together, her heart screaming with betrayal. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the cold metal knob, and for one moment, she allowed herself a final glance back. Edward hadn't turned around. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the city, his posture a declaration that he had already erased her from his life. The tears she had repressed slid down, hot against her cheeks, as she opened the door and stepped out into the sterile hallway. The echo of his words, "You are a mistake," followed her down the hall, each repetition carving itself deeper into her heart. She brought a hand to her stomach, her touch instinctively protective, and in that moment, she made a silent vow. He could deny them, he could try to erase their existence, but she would not. She would carry this child. She would fight for this child, and she would never let the cruelty of Edward Hayes define the life growing inside her. The apartment Sarah moved into was nothing more than a cramped studio, tucked into a tired old building on the outskirts of the city. But it became the fragile fortress where she tried to rebuild her life. The walls were thin, the floorboards creaked with every step, and in winter, the draft forced her to wear sweaters to sleep. But it was hers, and it was where she would raise her son. She sat alone at the tiny kitchen table, night after night, with bills spread out before her, the weight of her decisions pressing down like a storm cloud. The test that had once been snatched from her hands was now replaced by doctor's notes and appointment cards, each one reminding her of the life she carried, a life that gave her strength, even as it terrified her. She worked long hours at a local diner, the kind of place where the smell of fried food clung to her clothes and her feet ached at the end of every shift. The pay barely covered rent and groceries, and she often skipped meals so she could save a little more for the future. Her co-workers were kind but distant. They had their own struggles and didn't ask many questions. Customers came and went, leaving behind empty plates and crumpled bills. But none of them saw the silent war Sarah waged within herself every day. Her body grew heavier as the months passed, her ankles swelling after hours of being on her feet. But she pushed on, unwilling to let exhaustion or loneliness break her resolve. At night she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing through the city. Fear gnawed at her constantly. Fear of what would happen if she got sick, if she lost her job, if she couldn't provide for the child who was already more real to her than anything else in the world. Sometimes she would bury her face in her pillow and cry until her chest ached, but she never allowed herself to fully give up. She would whisper softly to her unborn baby, her voice trembling, but determined, promising love, security, and a future she had no idea how to build. Those whispered promises became her anchor, a fragile thread that pulled her through the darkest nights. Her parents lived far away, and she hadn't told them anything. The shame was too heavy, the thought of hearing their disappointment unbearable. Her friends from her old life had also faded away, absorbed in their own relationships, their own ambitions, leaving Sarah to face her new reality in silence. Loneliness became her constant companion, a shadow that followed her every step of the day. Yet, even in her solitude, she found a resilience she never knew she possessed. Every tiny kick she felt inside her reminded her that she wasn't truly alone, that her fight was not just for herself, but for the tiny life that was completely dependent on her. The first time she heard the baby's heartbeat, she crumbled in the sterile white clinic room, tears running freely as she pressed her hands over her stomach. The sound was fast, fragile, and yet unbelievably strong, filling the space with proof that no rejection, no cruelty, no denial could erase this existence. That day she walked home in a cold rain, soaked to the bone, but she carried inside her a warmth she couldn't describe. That heartbeat became the rhythm of her days, a reminder that the struggle was worth it. Sarah's world had become smaller, her circle tighter, but her purpose was growing larger with each passing day. She no longer measured her life in shifts and paychecks, but in the quiet moments of connection with the child she had yet to meet. Every ache, every sacrifice, every tear became part of the foundation she was laying for the future. Edward's words still haunted her, cutting deep into her memory, but they no longer defined her. She was determined to prove, if only to herself and the life within her, that what he had called a mistake would one day become her greatest triumph. What do you think of Sarah's strength in the face of such heartbreak? Do you believe she was right to build a life so far away from Edward, or should she have told her family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The night Sarah went into labor was one she would never forget, a storm both inside and outside her body. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and rain lashed against the windows of her small apartment as she fought to breathe through the first waves of pain. She gripped the edge of the worn kitchen table, her knuckles white, her legs trembling beneath her, as another contraction tore through her. For a moment she thought she could tough it out alone, but the intensity built so quickly that fear seized her chest. With shaking hands, she called a cab, grabbing her hospital bag as she stumbled out into the wet night, the water soaking her shoes, the city lights blurring in her vision as she fought back the mounting agony. The hospital was a blur of bright lights, urgent voices, and the beeping of machines. Nurses guided her quickly to a room, their words calm but insistent, as they settled her into the bed and strapped monitors to her body. She felt small in the sterile environment, dwarfed by the chaos, but inside her, there was a strength she couldn't explain. The hours stretched on, each contraction sharper, more all-consuming, her body drenched in sweat as she cried out into the air. She gripped the bed rails until her arms ached, her throat raw from gasps and screams. There were moments she thought she couldn't go on, when the pain would completely swallow her and she would beg for it to end. But each time she felt a faint movement inside her, a reminder of what she was fighting for. When the final push came, she thought her body would shatter. But then she heard it, the fragile cry of a new life piercing through the din. The sound was sharp, insistent, and so beautiful that tears instantly filled her eyes. The doctor announced it was a boy, and moments later, a small, wrinkled bundle was placed in her trembling arms. Sarah looked at him, her chest heaving, her tears falling onto his soft blonde hair. His tiny fists were clenched, his cries resounding in the room, and when his eyes opened for the first time, she was speechless. They were the same penetrating blue as Edward's, a mirror that brought back all the pain. But in that moment, those eyes belonged only to her son. She whispered his name, Nathan, as if it were a prayer, her lips trembling as she repeated it over and over, until it became real. The name felt right, solid and strong, as if it would carry him forward through a world that would not always be kind. Holding him against her chest, she felt the rhythm of his tiny heart, fast and determined, and for the first time since Edward had cast her out, she felt whole again. The exhaustion of labor weighed on her like a heavy blanket, but the warmth of Nathan's body gave her the strength to stay awake, to memorize every detail of his face, the softness of his skin, the faint smell of new life clinging to him. As the room grew quiet, the machines settled, and the nurses moved away to give her space. Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She traced a finger across Nathan's cheek, marveling at the miracle in her arms. All the loneliness, the hunger, the exhaustion of the past months faded into insignificance in the presence of this child. He was proof that she had held on, that she had chosen love over desperation. She bowed her head, pressing her lips softly to his forehead, and whispered promises she intended to keep for the rest of his life. She promised he would never feel unwanted, never know the sting of rejection, never believe he was a mistake. The storm outside still raged, the rain pounding against the hospital windows, but Sarah no longer felt afraid. In her arms, she held not just her son, but her future, a light that shone brighter than the darkness that had pursued her for so long. As she drifted into an exhausted sleep, with Nathan snuggled against her, she knew with absolute certainty that no matter what difficulties lay ahead, she would face them all. For him, she would survive anything. What do you think of Sarah's strength and her decision to name her son Nathan? How do you think she will be able to provide for him as a single mother? Comment below with your thoughts. Edward Hayes had spent the last 6 years building an empire bigger than even he had dreamed. But every new success left him more empty than the last. His blonde hair, immaculately styled for every magazine article, and his sharp blue eyes made him the picture of control. But behind the facade was a man who could find no peace in anything he owned. His penthouse was a sheath of burning glass, the floors gleaming, the rooms filled with everything a man of his wealth could desire. But the silence at night was deafening. He attended parties where the champagne never stopped flowing, and women in glittering dresses hung on his arm. But when the night ended and the lights were out, he always returned to an apartment that felt colder than ice. The acquisition of his yacht had been his latest indulgence, a sprawling vessel worth millions, outfitted with marble countertops, private staterooms, and a crew trained to anticipate his every whim. To the world, it was another symbol of his power, a floating palace where he could entertain clients or lovers, where he could remind everyone that he was a man above all others. But to Edward, the yacht was just another distraction, something he hoped could fill the emptiness inside him. He invited women on board, plied them with wine, and laughed at their jokes, but he always found himself looking past them, out at the horizon, with the persistent feeling that he was chasing something he could never reach. He told himself that loneliness was the price of greatness. He convinced himself that sacrifices had to be made, that emotions only made men weak. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the city outside his window was silent and he could no longer bury himself in work, he would hear the echo of his own words, spoken years ago. "You are a mistake." The phrase would return uninvited, bringing with it a sharp pang he would try to drown in liquor and business meetings. He never allowed himself to think about what those words had cost him, refusing to admit that somewhere there might be a child with his eyes, a child whose very existence he had refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Sarah was living in a very different world, raising Nathan in a modest apartment with creaking stairs and peeling paint. Edward never knew of the child's laughter echoing in the small rooms, of his endless questions about the world, of the way his blonde hair caught the sunlight, and his blue eyes, Edward's eyes, sparkled with curiosity. Nathan had grown into a bright, cheerful boy who loved stories and was fascinated by the sea, even though he had never known the father whose blood ran in his veins. Sarah protected him from the truth as best she could, giving him enough love for two, though in the quiet of the night she sometimes wondered how long she could keep the truth hidden. As Edward entertained investors on his yacht, showing off the gleaming decks and the hidden luxury within, he couldn't know how close his world was to colliding with the past he had tried so hard to erase. He had convinced himself that his choices were final, that he had cut every tie to what once bore, but fate had other plans, and soon the sea that brought him so many hollow nights of indulgence would bring back the one thing he had discarded, the woman he had broken, and the child he never knew. What do you think will happen when Edward and Sarah finally cross paths again? Do you think Sarah will be able to protect her son from him? The summer morning was warm, the sky painted in a brilliant shade of blue that seemed to promise a day of peace. Sarah woke early, as she always did, moving quietly through the apartment to not disturb Nathan's sleep. She stood for a long time at the window, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, watching her son stir under the thin blanket on the sofa they shared. At 5 years old, Nathan was already full of energy and curiosity, his blonde hair a mess, his blue eyes sparkling whenever he discovered something new. This morning, she wanted to give him something special, something beyond the routine of cramped walls and city streets. When her friend called with an unexpected opportunity to help on a yacht for the day, Sarah only briefly hesitated before accepting. The pay would be modest, but the idea of showing Nathan the sea filled her with excitement. She packed his small backpack with care, tucking in his favorite toy car and a sandwich, telling herself that this would be a memory he could cherish. When they arrived at the dock, Nathan's eyes widened at the sight of the vast stretch of water. His small hand gripped hers tightly as he stared up at the yacht looming before them, gleaming in the sunlight, like something out of a dream. To him, it looked like a castle on the sea, and his mouth hung open in awe as he whispered, "Mommy, it's huge." Sarah smiled at his wonder, though her chest tightened with nerves. She had no idea who owned the vessel, only that her friend had vouched for her skills in the kitchen and promised the work would be easy. She reminded herself it was just for one day, a chance to let Nathan see a world bigger than their small apartment, and she pushed down her anxiety as they boarded. The crew greeted her with polite nods, showing her to the galley where she would spend most of her time, preparing simple meals and helping with service. Nathan was allowed to sit quietly in the corner, drawing in his coloring book, as he often did when she worked. He sat with his legs crossed, his blonde head bent low, while Sarah tied on the apron she had been given and tried to focus on her tasks. Yet every so often, she would glance out at the deck through the narrow kitchen window, marveling at the horizon stretching out endlessly, the waves sparkling in the sun. She thought about how much Nathan would love to be out there, the sea breeze in his hair, his laughter floating over the water. The first few hours passed without incident. Sarah chopped vegetables, washed dishes, and followed the chef's instructions, while Nathan munched on the sandwich she had packed. The kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. The sounds of sizzling pans filled the air. For a brief time, she allowed herself to feel almost normal, almost as if this was just another job, not the strange, glittering world of wealth she had always avoided. She told herself she would finish the day, collect her pay, and leave with Nathan, both of them with the memory of the ocean in their hearts. But fate never let her off so easily. Late in the afternoon, voices rose outside the galley, deeper and sharper than those of the crew. A presence moved across the deck, with the kind of authority that silenced conversations, and Sarah froze, her knife stopping mid-chop. She heard approaching footsteps, the sound of a laugh that was both familiar and jarring. Her heart hammered wildly as she pressed her palms against the counter to steady herself, though she hadn't seen him yet. Nathan, oblivious to everything, had wandered over to the door, his coloring book in hand. He leaned forward, his blue eyes wide with curiosity, as he watched the man walk onto the deck. Sarah followed her son's gaze, and as her eyes landed on the tall figure with sun-kissed blonde hair and penetrating blue eyes, her breath caught in her throat. Edward Hayes was no more than 10 feet away, his tailored white shirt immaculate against his tanned skin, his confident stride owning the space, as if the yacht itself was his throne. Sarah's body tensed, her stomach twisted, as if the floor beneath her had vanished. She had spent years building a life without him, raising Nathan in the shadow of his absence, and now here he was, as sharp and imposing as the day he had cast her aside. Her first instinct was to pull Nathan away, to shield him from Edward's gaze, but it was already too late. Nathan had already stood in the doorway, the sunlight catching the blonde in his hair, his blue eyes, Edward's eyes, looking with curiosity at the stranger in front of him. In that single moment, Sarah knew that the fragile wall she had built around their life was about to collapse. The past she had fought so hard to bury had resurfaced, and it had found her here, on the sea, with her son at her side. What do you think will happen when Edward and Sarah finally cross paths again? Do you think Sarah will be able to protect her son from him? Edward froze, as his eyes landed on the small figure in the doorway. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, his blonde hair catching the sunlight in the exact shade that Edward saw in the mirror each morning, his blue eyes large and innocent, yet so piercingly familiar they sent a jolt down his spine. For a moment, the bustling sounds of the yacht disappeared. The clinking of glasses, the chatter of guests, the constant hum of the engines, and all that was left was the sight of the boy's gaze locking onto his. Edward's chest constricted, his throat suddenly dry, as if his body already knew the truth before his mind could process it. He reeled inwardly, though outwardly he forced himself to stand straight, his posture betraying only the slightest hesitation. Sarah appeared instantly, her movements quick and protective, pulling Nathan to her side, as if she could shield him with the force of her body alone. Her eyes, the same blue eyes that once looked at him with love, were now sharp with warning. She stood stiffly, every line of her posture screaming that she would not let him get close. Edward's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in years, he was speechless, stripped of the commanding voice that had once bent boardrooms and politicians to his will. He had built an empire, silenced opponents, conquered every challenge that dared to face him. But now he was helpless in the face of a child who wore his face. The silence stretched impossibly, thick and suffocating. Nathan looked up at Sarah with curiosity, tugging gently on her apron. "Mommy, who is that man?" he asked in a small voice, his innocence cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah tightened her grip, her hand trembling only slightly as she smoothed his hair. "Nobody important," she said, her words sharp, aimed at Edward more than her son. Her tone was laced with bitterness, every syllable meant to remind him of what he had abandoned. Edward took a step closer, unable to stop himself, though the weight in Sarah's gaze warned him to keep his distance. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, husky, stripped of the authority it used to carry. "Is he?" His eyes flickered to the boy and back, desperate for confirmation, even as the truth screamed in every detail of Nathan's face. Sarah's expression hardened, her jaw tightening, her anger burning through her exhaustion. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but cutting, every word precise. "This is Nathan, your son, the boy you called a mistake." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice didn't crack. She had cried enough years ago. Now she spoke with the strength of a woman who had raised a child alone. The word hit Edward, harder than any blow he had ever endured. His chest constricted, his stomach churned, and for a moment he felt as if the deck beneath him might give way. He remembered that day in his office, the look on Sarah's face as he dismissed her, the cold certainty in his own voice as he told her she meant nothing. The memory collided with the sight of Nathan, the living proof of the life he had rejected, and the weight of his cruelty settled on him like lead. Nathan looked between them, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to understand. "Mommy, what do you mean?" he asked softly. But Sarah knelt down and brushed his cheek, whispering something meant only for him. Edward couldn't hear the words, but the tenderness in her tone broke him open. She had carried it all, every hardship, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, without him, and she had done it with love. For the first time in his adult life, Edward felt small. He wanted to speak, to say he was wrong, to beg for forgiveness. But the words tangled in his throat. Sarah rose again, standing before him, her body positioned as a barrier between him and the child. "You don't get to come back into his life just because you finally saw what you chose to ignore," she said in a low voice, but with the force of a sentence. "You had your chance, and you threw it away." Edward's eyes stung, though no tears fell. His hands curled at his sides, not from anger, but from helplessness. He had faced hostile takeovers and ruthless enemies, but nothing had left him feeling as defeated as this moment. He opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything, but the only words that came were broken and weak. "I was wrong." Sarah's gaze didn't soften. She shook her head slightly, her voice firm and unbreakable. "One mistake doesn't undo 5 years. One mistake doesn't give him back the father he never had." She drew Nathan closer, and the boy leaned into her, still looking at Edward with large, inquisitive eyes. That look haunted him as he stood there, rooted to the spot. A man who had everything, but realized in an instant that he had nothing. The yacht around him gleamed with luxury. The sea stretched out endlessly beyond, but Edward had never felt more trapped, more empty, more desperate. As Sarah finally turned away, guiding Nathan back into the galley, Edward remained standing on the deck, watching them, his heart pounding. The sound of his son's small voice echoed in his mind, a voice full of questions he had no right to answer. He had built his life on power and denial, but standing there, watching the woman he had broken walk away with the child who carried his eyes, Edward Hayes felt the crushing truth. He had been the mistake all along. What do you think of Sarah's strength and her decision to confront Edward? Was she right to say he had no right to return to Nathan's life? Share your thoughts below. That night, Edward sat alone in his penthouse, the city sparkling below him like a field of stars. But the view only deepened the void within his chest. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then another. But no amount of alcohol could drown out the memory of Nathan's eyes looking up at him on the deck of the yacht. Those eyes had stripped away every shield he had built over the years, every illusion of control and invincibility, leaving him exposed and shaken in a way he couldn't explain. He thought of Sarah's voice, firm and unbreakable, as she named him the father of the child he had once dismissed. The words circled endlessly in his mind, a relentless reminder of the life he had cast aside, and the years he could never get back. For the first time in his adult life, Edward found himself questioning everything he had built. The empire that had once defined him now felt meaningless, its towers of glass and steel nothing compared to the weight of his own failures. He tried to focus on contracts, meetings, and deals, but every page blurred until all he could see was a small boy's blonde hair and the curve of his curious smile. At night, he would toss and turn, the echo of Sarah's bitterness chasing him in restless dreams, where he would reach for Nathan, but always find he was too late. When Julia, the woman who had been his companion for the last few months, noticed his distraction, she demanded answers. Over dinner, she pressed him, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently on the table, her sharp blue eyes narrowed with irritation. Finally, Edward told her the truth, his voice raspy as he admitted that he had a son, that he had abandoned him, and that he had seen him for the first time only a few days earlier. Julia's expression turned cold. She withdrew her hand, her lips tightened with disdain, and she made it clear she had no interest in being tied to a man with a hidden child from his past. She walked out of his apartment that night without looking back, and Edward didn't try to stop her. Strangely, her leaving didn't hurt him in the way it might have before. Instead, it left him facing the silence of his home with a clarity he had long avoided. He realized then that all the women, the wealth, and the distractions had been nothing more than flimsy masks to cover the truth. He had been running for years, pretending he could live without responsibility, without love, without the consequences of his choices. But Nathan's face had shattered that illusion forever. The following days were filled with a restlessness Edward couldn't shake. He drove through Sarah's neighborhood more than once, parking at a distance, his chest tightening as he saw her walking Nathan to school. He watched from afar as the boy skipped down the sidewalk, his small backpack bouncing, his laughter reaching him even from across the street. Sarah's hand never left his shoulder, guiding him gently, her face tired, but filled with a quiet strength. Edward stayed hidden, afraid to approach, afraid to intrude, but also unable to stay away. Every glimpse of them tore him apart, but also strengthened his resolve. He had lost 5 years, years he could never give back. But maybe he could give something now, if Sarah would allow it. Finally, after nights of torment and indecision, he knocked on her door. His heart hammered as he stood in the dim hallway of her apartment building, a place far removed from the polished lobbies and marble floors he was used to. When Sarah opened the door, her face betrayed no surprise, as if she had been expecting him all along. Her expression was guarded, her arms crossed, her blue eyes sharp and wary. Edward swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I need to talk," he said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Please." Nathan peeked out from behind her legs, his small hand gripping the fabric of her jeans. His big eyes met Edward's, filled with curiosity, but also with uncertainty, as if he could feel the tension he couldn't yet understand. Edward felt his chest clench with a painful ache. Guilt pressed in on him until he could barely breathe. He looked at Sarah, desperate. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I want to try now. I want to get to know him. I want to be his father, if you'll let me." Sarah's expression didn't waver. Her voice was quiet but firm, every word loaded with the strength of a woman who had carried everything alone. "Words are easy, Edward. Promises are easy. You weren't there for the sleepless nights, for the doctor's visits, for the days I thought I couldn't go on. You weren't there when he asked me about his dad, and I had nothing to tell him. You left both of us before he took his first breath." She glanced briefly at Nathan, then back to him. "If you want to be a part of his life, you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to him. You don't get to erase the past with one apology." Edward nodded. The weight of her words was heavy, but deserved. For once, he didn't argue, didn't try to bend her to his will. He understood she was right. Redemption wouldn't come in a night or 1,000 apologies, but only in the quiet persistence of showing up, of being present, of giving what he had once denied. When he walked out of her door that night, Nathan's eyes followed him, large and thoughtful, and Edward knew that no matter what it took, no matter how long it required, he would not leave again. For the first time in years, he carried with him not the emptiness of wealth, but the fragile spark of hope for a different future. What do you think of Edward's confession to Julia? Was he right to tell her the truth about Nathan? Share your thoughts below. The weeks that followed were a slow unfolding of something Edward had never known before. A life built not on power or wealth, but on patience, humility, and the fragile bonds of family. At first, his presence was awkward. Nathan would watch him with big, inquisitive eyes, unsure whether to treat him as a stranger or something more. And Sarah watched his every move, with the sharp attention of a guardian, unwilling to let him cause another wound. Edward didn't try to force his way in. He showed up quietly, offering to walk Nathan to school, to help with errands, to sit on the floor and build block towers that always came crashing down before they were finished. The boys' laughter, as the blocks tumbled into a heap, filled the small apartment in a way Edward had never experienced, louder and warmer than any applause he had received in his boardrooms. Sarah remained cautious. She would hover in the background during those first few visits, her arms crossed, ready to step in if needed. But as she watched Edward stumble through bedtime stories, mispronouncing words as Nathan giggled and corrected him, she began to see something change. This was not the man who had once turned his back on them, with ice in his voice. This was a man who was trying, failing sometimes, but coming back again and again, with a persistence that couldn't be faked. She still carried her anger, the memories of the nights she spent alone while Nathan cried, the endless exhaustion of raising a child with no support. But she couldn't ignore the evidence that Edward was slowly changing. Edward's own world was transformed in quiet but profound ways. He canceled late-night meetings, gave up responsibilities to others he had once hoarded out of a fear of losing control, and began leaving the office early to spend afternoons in Sarah's small apartment. The penthouse no longer felt like home. Its polished silence was unbearable in comparison to the sound of Nathan's voice asking him to play one more round of a game or tell one more story before bed. He even learned to cook simple meals, fumbling his way through recipes until Nathan proudly declared that the burnt pancakes were perfect. And Sarah, in spite of herself, would smile faintly at the sight. For a man who had once measured his worth in numbers and headlines, he now measured it in the moments Nathan would tuck his small hand into his without hesitation. One night, after Nathan had finally fallen asleep, Edward lingered at the kitchen table while Sarah washed the dishes. The hum of the refrigerator and the quiet rush of water filled the silence between them. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "I know I can never get back the years I stole. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I won't leave again. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I will prove it to both of you." His words trembled with a vulnerability Sarah had never heard in him before. She put down the dishcloth and turned to face him, her expression torn between old bitterness and something softer. For a long moment she said nothing, studying the man who had once broken her and was now asking to build something new. Finally she exhaled, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can ever forget what you did, Edward. But maybe, just maybe, I can learn to forgive. For his sake. For mine." The admission cost her something, and he saw it in the flicker of her eyes, but it also opened a door neither of them had dared to imagine before. Edward reached slowly across the table, almost afraid she would pull away. But when her hand met his, the warmth of her touch spread through him like sunlight. It was not the victorious triumph he had once sought in his business conquests. It was something far rarer, the fragile beginning of trust, of hope, of a second chance. He bowed his head, overwhelmed by the immensity of it, and for the first time since he was a young man, tears gathered in his eyes. "What do you think of Sarah's decision to forgive Edward? Is it too soon, or is it a necessary step for Nathan's sake? Tell us your thoughts below." The weeks turned into months, and the bond between father and son deepened. Edward took Nathan to the park, pushed him on the swings, taught him how to skip rocks across the water. He sat at the small kitchen table, helping with letters and numbers, fumbling his way through homework with the same determination he once put into financial reports. Sarah, though still cautious, began to watch with less suspicion and more quiet acceptance. The weight of the years didn't disappear overnight, but the cracks in her armor were beginning to show. And behind them was the woman she had once been. The woman who still wanted to believe in love. One night, as the three of them stood on the balcony of the yacht that had once symbolized only Edward's arrogance, the setting sun painted the water in gold. Nathan held both of their hands, his laughter carried on the breeze as he pointed out shapes in the clouds. Edward looked at Sarah, the light softening her features, and spoke words he once thought he could never say. You were right to fight for him. I was wrong about everything that mattered. But if you'll let me, I want to fight now. For both of you." Sarah met his gaze, her blue eyes filled with a mix of pain, history, and something new. She didn't reply right away, but she didn't pull her hand away either. In that silence, filled with the sound of the waves and her son's laughter, something fragile but unbreakable took root. It was not the naive love they had once shared, but something stronger, forged in suffering, molded by resilience, and given life by the child who had, unknowingly, brought them back together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah knew that the road ahead would not be simple. But standing there with Edward and Nathan at her side, she allowed herself for the first time in years to believe in the possibility of healing. And Edward, humbled and transformed, knew that this was the only future worth fighting for. What was your favorite moment in this story? Do you believe Edward and Sarah will be able to truly rebuild their family? Let us know in the comments below.